What if 19 men were handed a nation built by God Himself, and every single one of them threw it away? 19 kings, 19 chances, not one survivor. Because there was a pattern hiding inside that throne, and once a man sat down on it, he never walked away the same. Daniel Carter had read the list 4 times before his hands started shaking. He was 34 years old, sitting in the basement reading room of an archive in Washington, D.C., a place where the air smells like paper that has outlived everyone who touched it. He had come there for something simple, a footnote, a small correction to a paper nobody would read. He asked the archivist for anything connected to the kings of the Northern Kingdom, and the man brought him a box, and Daniel opened it expecting battles. He expected chariots. He expected conquest. He expected the kind of history that makes men into legends. Instead, he found a list, 19 names, and beside each one a verdict. He read the first name. He read the verdict. He nodded because that one he knew, that one he expected. He read the second name. Same verdict. He read the third, the fourth, the fifth. And somewhere around the 8th name, Daniel stopped reading and started counting because a suspicion was rising in his chest that he did not want to be true. He counted all 19. Then he sat back in the chair and said out loud to nobody, "That can't be right." The archivist, an older man named Walter, who had worked those rooms for 31 years, looked up from his desk. "Something wrong, son? There's a mistake in this record." "Doubt it." "No, there is. Look at this." Daniel turned the page around. 19 kings. 19, and every single one of them gets the same judgment. Every one. Not one exception. Walter didn't even lean forward. "That's not a mistake. It has to be. You don't get 19 for 19. Nobody bats 1,000 at anything, not even failure. There's always one. There's always somebody who breaks the streak." "Not in that kingdom," Walter said, and Daniel laughed because that's what a man does when the ground moves under him, and he isn't ready to admit it. Come on, 200 years, 9 different dynasties, assassinations, coups, complete regime changes, men who hated each other, who murdered each other to get that throne, and you're telling me not one of them, not a single one, ever tried something different. Walter took his glasses off and cleaned them slowly, the way old men do when they're deciding how much to say. "I'm telling you, they all tried something different. They just all failed the same." That sentence went into Daniel Carter like a splinter, and it stayed there for the next 2 years of his life. Because here is what bothered him. Daniel had studied collapse before. Empires, companies, marriages. Failure has variety. Some fall to enemies, some fall to plague, some rot slowly, and some snap all at once. Failure is creative. Failure surprises you. But this wasn't failure. This was a pattern. And patterns mean something is underneath. He wrote a single question at the top of a legal pad that night, and he underlined it twice. And that question is the reason this story exists. How does a nation that started with God collapse from the inside, not from outside? That's the part everybody misses. Daniel misses it too at first. He assumes Assyria. He assumes armies. He assumes the answer is a bigger nation with better spears showed up, and that was that. It wasn't. The knife came from inside the house. To understand it, Daniel had to go back further than the kings, and this is where the story turns, because most people think Israel's problem was that they were weak. Israel's problem was that they were chosen. Understand what that means. This nation did not begin with a founder, a general, a fortune, or a flag. It began with a promise made to an old man with no children. God told Abraham his descendants would be a blessing to the entire world, and Abraham had nothing to build that on except the voice that said it. From that promise came Israel. From Israel came 12 tribes. And from those tribes came a people who were for generations the strangest nation on earth, because they had no king. Think about how impossible that was. Every nation around them had a throne. Egypt had a pharaoh. The Philistines had lords. Every people group on that map had a man in a crown who told them what to do. Israel had none. God led them. God fed them in a desert where nothing grows. God fought for them when they were outnumbered. God gave them a law that protected the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner at a time when the rest of the world used those people as fuel. They didn't belong to a king. They belonged to God, and they hated it. That's the twist nobody sees coming. The people didn't lose their faith in a moment of tragedy. They lost it in a moment of comparison. They looked over the fence, saw the neighbors, and said the words that started everything. "Give us a king, like all the other nations." Not because God had failed them, because God was invisible, and a man is not. They wanted something they could see, something they could point at, something that would make them look normal. God warned them. He told them exactly what a king would do. He'll take your sons. He'll take your daughters. He'll take your fields, your harvest, your best of everything, and one day you'll cry out because of the king you begged for. And I won't answer you then. And the people heard every word of that warning and said, "We still want one." That is the first crack. Everything after it is just the crack widening. Now God, and this is the part that never stops astonishing Daniel. God gives them the king anyway. He does not destroy them for it. He does not walk away. He gives them what they asked for, and then he does something even more remarkable. He works through it. He gives them David, a shepherd, the youngest son, the one his own father didn't bother to call in from the field when the prophet came looking for a king, because nobody in that house thought the boy was worth considering. And David becomes the greatest king Israel ever had. He unites the tribes. He takes Jerusalem. He brings the ark of God into that city and dances in front of it like a man who doesn't care who's watching, because he has not forgotten who put him on the throne. That's the thing about David. He sinned. He sinned in ways that would end any career today, and the Bible does not hide a single detail of it. But when he was confronted, he broke. He didn't defend himself. He didn't spin it. He fell on his face and said, "I have sinned against the Lord." And God made him a promise anyway. A kingdom through his family that would never end. Hold on to that promise. It is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Then came Solomon and the Golden Age. Peace on every border. Wealth pouring in. A temple so beautiful that foreign rulers traveled hundreds of miles just to stand in it and go quiet. Israel at the summit. Israel admired. Israel untouchable. And Daniel Carter, sitting in that basement with that list in front of him, realized the most frightening thing in the entire record. The collapse begins here, not at the bottom, at the top. Because look at what happened. Solomon had wisdom no man had ever been given, and he still lost his heart. Not to an army, to comfort, to accumulation, to 1,000 small compromises that each seemed reasonable at the time. Nobody stormed the gates. Nobody had to. The greatest danger to Israel was never outside its borders. It was inside the human chest. Daniel called Walter over one afternoon and asked him a question he'd been chewing on for weeks. Why 19? Why does the record keep count? Why not just say the kingdom fell and be done with it? Walter looked at the list for a long moment. Because a number is an argument, he said. 1 king fails, that's a man. 2 fails, that's bad luck. 19 fails in a row across 9 dynasties, with different families and different enemies and different centuries. He tapped the page. 19 isn't a story about men. 19 is a story about something in men. And what's that? Walter said, "You'll find it. It's in the first one. It's in all of them. But it starts in the first one, and once you see it, you'll see it in every name on that page. You'll probably see it somewhere closer than that, too." Daniel didn't understand what he meant by that last part. He would, because here is what this whole account is going to show. 19 kings inherited a nation built on a promise. Every one of them wanted God's blessing. Not one of them wanted God's authority. They wanted the protection without the surrender, the miracle without the obedience, the crown without the king. And the mechanism that destroyed them every single time was not evil in the way people imagine evil. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was something quieter, something far more familiar, something that lives in ordinary people who have never hurt anybody in their lives. It was fear of losing control. That's it. That's the pattern nobody survived. 19 men sat on that throne, and every one of them eventually reached the same moment. The moment where obeying God meant risking something they were holding, and every one of them made the same choice. They kept what they were holding, and they lost everything else. The first king of the northern kingdom was a man God personally promised a lasting dynasty. Personally. A direct promise, the same kind David got. He had everything. And within a few short years, he did something so devastating that for the next 200 years, the Bible would describe king after king after king with the same haunting sentence, like a diagnosis stamped on a chart. He walked in the sins of the man who made Israel sin. One frightened man's decision became the identity of an entire nation. And it started with a look over his shoulder. A look over his shoulder. That was all it took. Daniel found the man's name 3 pages in, and the first thing he noticed was that the record did not introduce him as a villain. It introduced him as a victim. Jeroboam had been a laborer, a supervisor of forced work crews, the kind of man who spent his days watching other men break their backs under a tax burden that never got lighter. He knew what the crown cost because he'd carried the bill, and a prophet found him on a road one day and did something almost unbelievable. He tore his own coat into 12 pieces, handed 10 of them to Jeroboam, and said in effect, "God is giving you a kingdom." Then came the promise. Daniel read it twice because he could not believe the terms. "If you listen to everything I command you, and walk in my ways, I will be with you, and build you a dynasty as lasting as the one I built for David." Daniel put the page down. "Walter." He got David's deal. He did. No, listen to me. Daniel was up out of the chair now. This isn't God tolerated him. This isn't God allowed it. God offered this man the exact same covenant he gave David, an everlasting dynasty, handed to a construction foreman on the side of a road. Walter kept writing. Correct. Then how does he end up as the man they name the disease after? Walter finally looked up, because the promise had a condition, and the condition was the one thing he couldn't do, which was trust it. Here is what happened, and it happened fast, which is the part that should frighten every person listening. The kingdom split. The northern tribes came to Solomon's son with a request that was not a rebellion, not a threat, just a plea from exhausted people. Your father made our load heavy. Lighten it a little and we will serve you forever. The young king asked for 3 days. He went to the old men who had served his father, and they told him the truth. Speak kindly to them today, and they'll be your servants for life. Then he went to the men he'd grown up with, and they told him what he wanted to hear. Tell them your little finger is thicker than your father's waist. Tell them he beat you with whips, and you'll beat them with scorpions. He chose his friends over his elders. He chose looking strong over being wise. And with one sentence, a united kingdom that had taken David a lifetime to build came apart in an afternoon. 10 tribes walked out, and Jeroboam, the foreman, the exile, the man with 10 pieces of a torn coat, sat down on a throne that God had personally promised him. He had everything. He lasted about a year before he destroyed it. Not with murder, not with an army, with arithmetic, because Jeroboam sat in his new capital and did the math. 3 times a year, every man in his kingdom was going to walk south, to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the city where the other king lived, the rival, the son of Solomon. They'd go up, they'd worship, they'd stand in that temple and remember whose family God had made a covenant with. And Jeroboam thought the thought that ended his line. If these people keep going up to that house, their hearts will turn back to their old master. They'll kill me and go back to him. Read that again. He wasn't wrong about the risk. He was just wrong about who was holding him up. God had told him, obey me, and I will build you a house like David's. And Jeroboam looked at that promise and calculated that it wasn't enough insurance. He didn't stop believing in God. He stopped believing God would keep his word without help. That's the twist. That's the whole disease in one sentence, and Daniel underlined it so hard he tore the page. Jeroboam did not become an atheist. He became a manager. He built 2 golden calves, one in the north, one in the south, so nobody would have to travel far. He set them up and said the words that echo through the next 2 centuries. It's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. He didn't tell them to abandon God. He told them God was closer now, more convenient, easier. He wasn't offering them a different religion. He was offering them a shortcut. Then he built shrines on high places. Then he appointed priests from any family that wanted the job. Men with no calling, no lineage, no business standing there. Then he invented a festival in the 8th month, on a day he made up in his own heart, because the real one fell in the 7th month, and the real one pointed south. Daniel sat with that for a long time before he said anything. He kept the name. What's that? He kept God's name on it. Daniel's voice had gone quiet. He called them the gods who brought you out of Egypt. That's God's resume. He put God's name on his own invention. Walter nodded slowly. Now you're seeing it. That's worse than idolatry. Considerably, because an idol you can spot, Daniel said. A man bows to a statue of Baal. Everybody knows what that is. But this looks like worship. It sounds like worship. It uses the right words. The people in that kingdom did not think they'd left God. They thought they were being obedient. He didn't take God away from them. He replaced him with a version they could keep in the building. Walter said, "And how many generations do you think it took before nobody remembered the difference?" And Daniel didn't answer, because the answer was one. It took one. A prophet showed up at Jeroboam's altar and cried out against it, and Jeroboam stretched out his hand and shouted, "Seize him!" And his arm withered where it was, right there, stuck out in the air dead. The altar split open behind him, and Jeroboam, terrified, begged the prophet to pray for him. The prophet prayed, the hand was restored, and Daniel waited for the repentance. It never came. The very next line of the record says that after this, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way. He went right back to appointing priests for the high places with the hand God had just healed. That is the moment Daniel understood what he was actually reading. He saw a miracle, Daniel said. He felt it. It happened in his own body, and it changed nothing. Seeing God's power, Walter said, is not the same as surrendering to God's authority. Those are two different organs, son. One's the eye, the other's the will. Then it got worse. Jeroboam's son got sick. The boy was dying, and Jeroboam knew exactly who to ask. So he told his wife to disguise herself, put on ordinary clothes, and go to the old prophet's house, because he did not want anyone to know the king still needed God. Think about the cowardice in that. He'd built a whole religion to avoid needing God, and the first time his child spiked a fever, he sent his wife in a costume to go beg the God he'd replaced. The prophet was blind by then. He heard her feet at the door and said, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why are you pretending to be someone else?" And then he told her, "Your son will die the moment you step back into the city, and he'll be the only one in your family who gets a grave, because he's the only one in whom God found anything good." She walked home. She crossed the threshold. The boy died. Daniel closed the book. He sat there a while. "He was warned by a prophet," he said finally. "He was warned by his own hand withering. He was warned by his son's death, 3 warnings, and he did not turn. 22 years on the throne," Walter said, "and every year of it he had time. Here is where the pattern locks in, and this is the part that turns a sad story into a horror story. Jeroboam died. His son Nadab took the throne, walked in his father's ways, and was murdered by a man named Baasha within 2 years. Baasha wiped out Jeroboam's entire family, every last one, exactly as the prophet said. Baasha now had a clean slate, brand new dynasty, no obligation to the dead man's sins. He could have torn down the calves the same week. He kept them. Baasha died. His son Elah took over and got drunk in a friend's house and was assassinated by his own chariot commander Zimri, who then killed every male in Baasha's family. Zimri lasted 7 days before the army made Omri king, and Zimri burned the palace down on top of himself rather than be captured. 7 days. And in those 7 days, the record still says he walked in the sins of Jeroboam. That's what breaks me, Daniel said. These men hated each other. They slaughtered each other's families. Every one of them came in as a reformer, a new start, a fresh dynasty. And every single one of them looked at those golden calves, the exact thing that damned the man they'd just murdered, and kept them. Why do you think? Daniel already knew. He just didn't want to say it. Because it worked, he said. It kept the people home. It kept the money in the north. It kept the throne under them. It was useful. Walter said, That's it. That's the whole thing. They didn't keep the calves because they loved them. They kept them because tearing them down would have cost something, and not one of them was willing to pay. 9 dynasties, 9 chances to start clean. 19 men who all inherited a lie because it was profitable and passed it down because it was easier than the truth. And the worst of them hadn't even been born yet. Omri won the war for the throne, and Daniel almost skipped past him because the record gives him 6 verses and moves on. 6 verses for the most successful king the Northern Kingdom ever produced. That's the strangest thing in this whole book, Daniel said. I went and looked him up outside the Bible. The Assyrians named the whole country after him. 150 years after he died, they were still calling Israel the House of Omri. Foreign records, foreign kings, that's the name they knew. He built Samaria from nothing. He was the one man in that entire list who made the world sit up and notice. Walter didn't look impressed. And what does the book say about him? That he did worse than everyone before him. 6 verses. 6 verses, Daniel said. The Assyrians gave him a monument. God gave him a paragraph. That was the first crack in something Daniel had believed his whole life without ever examining it. He had assumed quietly the way most people do that success and God's approval travel together. That if a man builds, prospers, wins, expands somewhere. In there is a signal that heaven approves. Omri destroyed that assumption in 6 verses. Because the record isn't keeping score the way the world keeps score. It isn't measuring what a man built. It's measuring what a man loved. And then, Omri had a son. Daniel had heard the name his entire life and never once understood it. Ahab. He'd always pictured a cartoon, a snarling tyrant, the kind of villain who twirls something. That is not what he found. What he found was a competent man. Ahab was a builder. He fortified cities. He won wars, real ones against Syria twice, and both times a prophet came to him beforehand and told him exactly how to do it. He had a palace inlaid with ivory. He was by every measure that a resume measures effective. And the record says he did more to provoke God than every king before him combined. How? Daniel asked. What's the mechanism, Jeroboam? I understand he was scared. But this man wasn't scared of anything. Walter said he married. And that's the twist, and it's smaller and more ordinary than anyone expects. Jeroboam's calves were a compromise, a shortcut. A domesticated god you could keep in the building. For 200 years the kings kept that shortcut because it was useful, and none of them ever thought of themselves as men who had left God. They thought they were men who had made God convenient. Ahab married a woman who had never known that God at all. Jezebel was a princess of Sidon, the daughter of a priest king, and she did not come north to blend in. She came with a mission. She brought Baal with her, and she brought conviction. And this is the thing Daniel could not get past. She was the only person in the entire story who was completely sincere. She believed, he said. That's what's so horrifying. Every king in this list is a compromiser, half in, half out, hedging, managing. And then this woman walks in, and she actually believes something all the way down, and she's willing to kill for it. And what did Ahab believe? Daniel thought about it. Nothing. He believed in whatever was in front of him. Which is why she ran him. She put 450 prophets of Baal on the royal payroll, 400 of another god at her own table. And then she started hunting God's prophets one by one, executing them until a man named Obadiah, who worked inside Ahab's own house, hid 100 of them in caves and fed them bread and water in secret, while smiling at his king every morning. Let that land. There were men in that kingdom risking their lives for God, and they were doing it from inside the palace, under the roof of the man destroying the country. The distinction Daniel finally saw, and it's the hinge of the entire story, is this. Jeroboam replaced God's worship. Jezebel tried to replace God. One is a shortcut, the other is a war, and it worked. Within a few years, a nation that had been founded on the words, "You shall have no other gods before me," had a state religion with a state budget and a state execution list. Not because the people voted for it, because nobody stopped it. That's when God did something that made no sense. He sent one man, no army, no coalition, no movement. One man from nowhere, from a town nobody could find on a map, and the first words out of his mouth were a death sentence on the entire economy. As the Lord lives, there will be no dew or rain these years except at my word. And then he vanished for 3.5 years. Daniel loved that detail more than any other in the book. He didn't attack Baal's followers. He attacked Baal's job description. That's what Baal was. Storm god, rain god. The whole reason you'd worship him is that he makes things grow. So Elijah shuts off the sky and says, "All right, let's see him work." 3 years of nothing. 3 years of Ahab searching every nation on earth for one man and not finding him. 3 years of the queen's god failing publicly every single morning in front of a starving country. And it changed nothing. That's the mini-collapse inside the collapse. 3.5 years of undeniable evidence, and when Elijah finally walked back into the throne room, Ahab's first words to him were not repentance. They were, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" Daniel actually laughed out loud in the reading room. He blamed him. The country's starving, and he blames the guy who told him why. "Men will always blame the messenger," Walter said. "It's cheaper than blaming the mirror." So Elijah gave him the challenge. Bring everybody, bring all 850 of them, Mount Carmel. And here is the sentence in that whole account that matters most, and almost nobody notices it. Elijah turned to the people before anything else happened, and he asked them a question. "How long will you go limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is, follow him." And the people said nothing, not a word. Total silence. "That's the diagnosis," Daniel said, and his voice had changed. Right there. They didn't say Baal. They didn't say the Lord. They said nothing because they wanted both. That's the disease, not rebellion, not atheism, limping, trying to keep one foot in each world so you never have to lose either one. Walter said, "And what happens to a man who limps between two opinions long enough? He can't run when it matters. Then came the fire. Then Elijah rebuilt the altar of God that had been torn down, and he did something that has never made sense to anyone reading it for the first time. He dug a trench around it and had them pour water over the whole thing. 12 jars, 3 separate times. In the middle of a drought, he wasted water. He filled the trench. He removed every excuse. Then he prayed, and it took him maybe 15 seconds, and there was nothing theatrical in it. He just asked God to let the people know that their hearts could still be turned back. And the fire fell. It took the sacrifice. It took the wood. It took the stones. It took the dust. It licked up the water in the trench. And the whole nation went down on their faces and screamed the only thing left to scream. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Daniel had read that 100 times as a boy, and it had always felt like the ending. This time, he turned the page. And the twist in this entire story, the one that changed how Daniel Carter saw his own life, is what happens next. Ahab went home and told his wife. That's it. That's what he did. He watched fire fall from heaven, watched his wife's entire religious establishment collapse in one afternoon, and he went home and reported it to her like a man describing weather. And Jezebel sent Elijah a message that said, "By this time tomorrow you'll be dead like they are." One threat, one woman, one note, and Elijah, the man who had just called down fire, ran for his life into the wilderness and sat under a tree and asked God to kill him. He won, Daniel said. He was gripping the edge of the table. He won, Walter. Total victory. Complete, undeniable public victory. And it lasted less than a day. Because a miracle doesn't change a heart, Walter said. It can't. It never has. Those people on that mountain were sincere when they hit the ground, and a week later they were limping again, because nothing had actually been surrendered. They felt something. They didn't give anything up. And there it is. That is the message hiding under 200 years of blood. Seeing God is not the same as obeying God. Every king in that list saw. Jeroboam felt his hand die and come back. Ahab watched heaven open and burn a mountain. Israel screamed the truth with their faces in the dirt. And every one of them went home and kept the calves. Because the human heart does not resist God by denying Him. It resists God by admiring Him from a safe distance and refusing to hand over the one thing He asked for. Ahab proved it a few chapters later, when a man named Naboth wouldn't sell him a vineyard, and Ahab went to bed and turned his face to the wall and wouldn't eat, sulking like a child over a garden. And Jezebel looked at her husband and said the sentence that should be carved over every throne in history. Are you not the king of Israel? Get up. I'll get you the vineyard. She had a man of God's own people falsely accused and stoned to death over a plot of dirt. And Ahab, who had watched fire fall from heaven, got up and went down and took possession of the land. That is the pattern. Not one of them survived it. And the kingdom had less than 200 years left. Less than 200 years, and God gave them one more chance to break the pattern. He gave them a man with a sword and a mandate. Daniel found him and thought, finally somebody who does it. Jehu was an army commander, and God had him anointed in secret with one instruction: wipe out the house of Ahab. And Jehu did it with a ferocity that still makes readers uncomfortable 3,000 years later. He killed the king. He hunted down the king of Judah. He rode into the city, and Jezebel painted her eyes and dressed her hair and met him from a window with a taunt on her lips. And he asked who was on his side, and 2 servants threw her down into the street. He killed 70 sons of Ahab. He gathered every priest and prophet and worshipper of Baal in the country into one temple on the pretense of holding a great festival for their god, and he sealed the doors, and he ended Baal in Israel in a single afternoon. Daniel was almost cheering. This is it. This is the one. He tore it out by the roots. He didn't compromise. He didn't manage it. He burned the whole system down. God even promises him 4 generations on the throne. Walter said, "Keep reading." And Daniel kept reading, and his face changed. Because the very next sentence after all that blood, after all that zeal, says that Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the golden calves. He left them standing. Daniel sat back like he'd been hit. He destroyed Baal, he said slowly. He destroyed the foreign god, the obvious one, the one with the foreign queen and the foreign priests and the temple you could point at from the road. He killed all of that in one day. And he kept the calves. Daniel's voice dropped. He kept the ones with God's name on them. Walter finally set his pen down. Now you understand why 19 men failed. He wasn't reforming, Daniel said. He was purging. There's a difference. He removed his rival's religion. He didn't remove the thing that made him useful to himself. Say the rest of it. Daniel had to work up to it. The most zealous man in the entire list, the only one who ever actually swung a sword for God, still would not touch the one sin that kept his people home and his treasury full. He looked up. It's not that they couldn't tell truth from lies. Jehu could tell. Everybody could tell. It's that they'd sorted sin into 2 piles. The kind that costs you nothing to condemn, and the kind you're living on. Walter said, "And which pile do you think most men clean out?" That was the second time Walter had aimed something at him, and this time Daniel felt it land. Because here's what Jehu proved, and it's the ugliest truth in the whole account. You can be furious about evil and still be owned by it. You can hate what other people worship and never once examine what you worship. Jehu's rage was real. His obedience was partial. And partial obedience in the language of that record is just disobedience with better publicity. God gave his family 4 generations anyway, kept the promise. Because God kept keeping promises to men who broke theirs. And that is the pattern nobody talks about, running quietly underneath. The other one the whole time. Then came the strangest king of all, and Daniel almost missed him too. Jeroboam the second. Same name as the first, different man. And Daniel had to read the passage 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding it, because it says this king did evil in God's sight, that he did not turn from the sins of the first Jeroboam. And then in the very same breath, it says, God used him to restore Israel's borders to their greatest extent since Solomon. That's a typo, Daniel said. It's not. Walter, God blessed him. God expanded his kingdom. It says right here, God saw Israel's suffering, and there was no one to help them, so he saved them by the hand of this man. And this man was wicked. Yes, then what's the lesson? Because from the inside, if you're an Israelite living in that generation, what do you see? You see 41 years of prosperity, gold, trade, territory, peace. You see the biggest boom in 2 centuries. Daniel's hands were flat on the table. You'd think God was pleased. You'd think everything was fine. And there, Walter said, is the most dangerous moment in the entire 200 years. Daniel went quiet. Not the drought, not the war, not the queen with the death list, the boom. Because when things are going badly, a nation asks what it did wrong. When things are going well, a nation stops asking anything at all. And that's when God sent them the 2 loudest voices he ever sent. Amos was a farmer, a fig tender from the southern kingdom, no credentials, no school, no lineage. And he walked north into the middle of the Golden Age and told them their worship made God sick. Not their sin, their worship. He told them God hated their festivals, wouldn't accept their offerings, told them to take away the noise of their songs because he wouldn't listen to it. And Daniel read the reason and felt something turn in his stomach because the reason wasn't idolatry. It was the poor. They were selling a man for a pair of sandals, crushing the needy, cheating with rigged scales, building summer houses and winter houses, lying on beds of ivory, eating the best lambs, singing songs, drinking out of bowls, and not one of them was grieved about the ruin of their own country. They were in church, Daniel said. That's what kills me. They were in church every week. They weren't skipping the festivals. They were packing them out. And God said he couldn't stand the smell of it because they walked out of the service and went right back to grinding the poor into the dirt. Walter said, "What did Amos ask for instead?" Daniel found it. He read it out loud and his voice cracked on it. "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." He put the book down. And the priest of Bethel, the man in charge of the golden calf shrine, wrote to the king and reported Amos as a threat to national security. Then he told Amos to go home. Go prophesy in your own country. Don't ever prophesy here again, because this is the king's sanctuary. The king's sanctuary, not God's. The priest said it out loud and didn't even hear himself. Then came Hosea, and this is where Daniel had to stop for a week, because God told Hosea to marry a woman who would be unfaithful to him. And Hosea did, and she was. She left him for other men, and she ended up so far down that she was standing on an auction block being sold, and God told Hosea to go buy his own wife back. He paid for her 15 shekels and a load of barley. He paid to get back the woman who had humiliated him publicly. Why? Daniel asked. Why put a man through that? Because they wouldn't listen to words anymore, Walter said. So he gave them a picture. He made a man live it in front of them, so they'd understand what they'd been doing to him for 200 years. Daniel sat with that for a long moment. So this whole time, he said, I've been reading this like a courtroom, like God's the judge, and he's finally had enough, and he drops the hammer. And now I think it's a marriage. Daniel's eyes were wet, and he didn't care. It's not a judge losing patience. It's a husband being betrayed for 200 years and standing in the marketplace buying her back anyway. And that is the answer to the question he'd written on a legal pad 2 years earlier and underlined twice. How does a nation that started with God collapse from the inside? It doesn't happen when the enemy shows up. It happens when the people stop being able to tell the difference between God and the version of God they built for themselves. And by then, there's nothing left to defend because everything worth defending was already gone. The end came fast after that. Jeroboam's son lasted 6 months, assassinated. The next man lasted 1 month, assassinated. Then a man who ripped open pregnant women, and then his son assassinated by Hoshea, the last one. 6 kings in about 25 years, 4 of them murdered, and Assyria, the greatest killing machine the world had ever built, was moving. And Hoshea, the last king of Israel, did the same thing the first one did. He calculated. He paid tribute to Assyria to buy time. Then he sent secret messengers to Egypt, trying to play the 2 superpowers against each other, trying to survive by strategy, trying to manage. 200 years of prophets and the final king of Israel responded to the end of the world with a diplomatic maneuver. Assyria found out. They arrested him. They came and they laid siege to Samaria. The city Omri built, and the siege lasted 3 years. 3 years of starvation behind those walls. And in 722 BC, the walls came down. The people were taken away, marched out, scattered across the Assyrian Empire, resettled in places whose names meant nothing to them, and the northern kingdom of Israel simply stopped existing. 10 tribes gone. And then the record does something Daniel wasn't ready for. It stops the narrative. It stops telling the story, and it delivers the autopsy. And it's the longest explanation of its kind in the entire book. It says this happened because they sinned against the Lord, who brought them up out of Egypt. It says they built high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. It says God warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways," and they would not listen. They were stubborn like their fathers who did not believe. And then the line that finished Daniel. They rejected his statutes and his covenant, and they went after worthless things and became worthless. He read that, and he understood. You become what you worship. That's not poetry. That's the mechanism. They chased something empty, and it emptied them. Daniel closed the book. 208 years, he said. 19 kings, 9 dynasties, 8 assassinations, and the same sentence stamped on every one of them like a coroner's report that never changed. Walter said nothing. They weren't destroyed by Assyria, Daniel said. Assyria just showed up to collect. The kingdom died from the inside 150 years before anybody buried it. And the record ends the northern kingdom with a whisper, not a scream. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. Until this day. The record had already been closed. The verdict was already in. 19 for 19. 19 for 19, and Daniel Carter should have been finished. The paper was written. The footnote was corrected. He had what he came for 2 years ago and more. And every professional instinct in him said, close the box. Thank the old man, go home. He didn't move. Walter noticed. He always noticed. Something's still bothering you. Yeah. Say it. The record shouldn't end like that. Daniel tapped the closed book. Think about it. If you're the writer and your whole point is that these kings failed you, stop at the autopsy. You've made the argument. 19 for 19, the kingdom's gone, case closed. He looked up. So why does the book keep going? Walter almost smiled. Because the argument was never about the kings. Then what was it about? You've been reading it upside down for 2 years, son. You've been counting failures. Try counting the other column. Daniel didn't understand at first. Then he did, and it hit him so hard he had to open the book again, because he went back through it and he started counting the other thing, and what he found broke him. Jeroboam got a personal covenant betrayed it inside of a year, and God still sent him a prophet at his own altar, still healed his hand when he begged, still gave his one good son a grave and a mourning, because God found something good in a boy in a house he was destroying. Baasha murdered his way to the throne, and God sent him a prophet. Ahab, the worst of them, married to a woman hunting God's servants for sport, and God sent him Elijah. Then fire. Then 2 military victories he did not earn, delivered by prophets he did not deserve. And when Ahab finally briefly tore his clothes over Naboth's vineyard and walked around in sackcloth for a few days, God noticed. God said, "Do you see how he has humbled himself, and he delayed the judgment? For that, for a few days of sackcloth from the man who let his wife murder a neighbor over a garden." Jehu got 4 generations for partial obedience. Jeroboam II, wicked, unrepentant, got 41 years of prosperity and the biggest borders since Solomon, because God saw his people suffering, and there was no one to help them. Daniel's hands were shaking again the same way they'd shaken the first day. "Every single one of them," he said. "Every single one. Not one king got what he deserved on schedule. Not one. Keep going." 208 years. Daniel's voice was breaking now. 208 years of him sending prophet after prophet into a country that killed prophets. Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, Micah. He didn't send them once. He sent them for 2 centuries into the same rejection over and over to people who had made it a family tradition to ignore him. Walter said, "Now say the thing you've been circling for 2 years." Daniel looked at the list of 19 names. "They're not the main character," he said. "No. I thought this was a story about 19 men who failed." He put his hand flat on the page. "It's a story about one God who wouldn't." That was the twist. That was the whole thing, and it had been sitting in front of him the entire time, and he'd missed it because he was counting the wrong column. The pattern "nobody survived" was real, but it was running alongside a second pattern, and the second one never broke either. 19 men refused him, and he came back 19 times. "So what's the answer?" Daniel asked. "Practically, if the throne itself was the problem, if every man who sat in it got eaten by it, then what God just doesn't do kings anymore. He gives up on the idea." Walter said, "Read Hosea again, the end of it." And Daniel found it, and this is where the ground moved for the last time. Because Hosea, the man who bought his own wife off an auction block, wrote something in the middle of that heartbreak that made no sense in 722 BC. He wrote that the children of Israel would live many days without a king, without a prince, without a sacrifice, without an ephod, which is exactly what happened. 10 tribes scattered, no throne, nothing. And then Hosea says afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king." Daniel stared at the word. David's been dead 300 years when he writes this. Yes. He's not talking about David. No. He's talking about somebody who hasn't come yet. Daniel sat back. The prophets are standing in the wreckage of the worst monarchy in human history, and they're promising another king. That's right. Why would anyone want another king? Look at the evidence, 19 data points, and they all say the same thing. Why would God do this to them again? Walter leaned forward, and for the first time in 2 years, the old man's voice had something in it that Daniel had never heard. "Because he wasn't going to send them a better man," Walter said. "He was going to send them himself." And every prophet in that wreckage started describing him, and none of them could have invented what they were describing. Isaiah said the government would be on his shoulders, and then in the same breath called him Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Daniel had to stop and read it 4 times, because a prophet in a nation of failed kings just called the coming king God. Micah said he'd come out of Bethlehem, a town too small to matter, and that his goings forth were from everlasting. Ezekiel said God had watched the shepherds of Israel feed themselves instead of the flock for centuries, and said, "I will search for my sheep myself. I will be their shepherd myself." And then Isaiah described him being crushed, pierced, silent in front of his accusers, a king who dies for the people he rules. "That's not a king," Daniel said. "That's a sacrifice." "It's both," Walter said. "That's the point. Every king in your list took from the people to protect the throne. This one gives up the throne to protect the people. It's not an improved version of Jeroboam. It's the opposite of Jeroboam in every single place Jeroboam broke." And Daniel started matching them up, and it undid him. Jeroboam looked at God's promise and calculated it wasn't enough security, so he built something he could control. Jesus stood in a wilderness and was offered every kingdom on earth, all of it right there, no cross required, and he said, no. He refused the shortcut. He is the only one who has ever handed the calf and turned it down. Ahab watched fire fall and went home and told his wife about it. Jesus watched a garden's worth of pressure fall on him and sweat like blood, and said, "Not my will, but yours." Jehu tore down the God that cost him nothing and kept the sin that made him money. Jesus walked into the temple, the one place where his own name was being used as a business, and he turned the tables over, and it cost him his life within the week. Every king in that list asked the same question. Can I hold my power and hold God too? Jesus never asked it. He answered it by letting go of everything. Born in the line of David, exactly as promised into the family whose covenant God never canceled through 400 years of men who deserved to have it canceled. He walked through Samaria. Daniel found that and could not breathe. The territory of the northern kingdom, the dead kingdom, the place of the calves, the place God had exiled, and the record had closed with the words, "Until this day." He walked right into it and sat down by a well and talked to a woman. Nobody else would talk to a woman from the people God had scattered, and he told her that the day was coming when it wouldn't matter which mountain you stood on. 200 years of kings fighting over where people worshipped. And the true king walked into the ruins of that fight and told a broken woman the location was never the point. The heart was. He went to the place the record said God had rejected, and he went looking for one person. He didn't come to fix the kings, Daniel said quietly. He came to be the king they never were. And here is where the story stops being about them. Because Daniel finally understood what Walter had aimed at him twice, and he dodged both times. The calves are gone. Nobody's building golden animals anymore, but the mechanism is untouched because the mechanism was never metal. It was a man who believed God respected God, would have told you he served God, and who still could not bring himself to hand over the one thing he thought was holding his life together. That's not an ancient problem. That's Tuesday. Every person alive has something they've quietly decided God isn't allowed to touch. A grudge, a career, a fear, a relationship, a version of themselves they've built and cannot let go of. And like Jeroboam, they don't call it rebellion. They call it being realistic. They call it managing. They keep the calf because the calf works. 19 men proved you cannot do it. You cannot hold the throne and hold God. One of them will always have to go. Daniel closed the book for the last time and looked at Walter. "You knew," he said. "You knew the first day. You said I'd find it somewhere closer than the page." Walter stood up slowly, the way a man does after 31 years in the same room. "Everybody who reads that list looks for the exception," he said. "Some king who beat it. And there isn't one. And that's not the tragedy, son. That's the mercy. Because if even one of them had pulled it off, you'd spend your whole life trying to be him. 19 failures is God telling you to stop trying to be the king." He picked up his coat. "There's only ever been one who could sit there. And he didn't take the throne. He climbed onto a cross, and he said it was finished, and he meant all of it. Every calf, every compromise, every frightened man who ever tried to protect himself from the God who was trying to save him." Then Walter said the last thing, and he said it like a man handing over something he'd carried a long time. They wanted a king they could see. 2,000 years ago, God gave them one, and they crucified him. And he rose anyway, because he was never a king they could control. The northern kingdom is gone. 19 men held that throne, and every one of them lost it because a crown cannot save the man wearing it. But the promise God made to a shepherd boy outlived the kingdom that betrayed it, outlived the exile, outlived the empire that carried it away. It is still standing today. 19 kings asked, "Can I keep control and keep God?" 19 kings answered wrong. Only one king ever laid the crown down, and he is the only one who never lost it. And he is still saying to every heart holding a golden calf in the dark the same words he said in the ruins of Samaria, "The hour is coming. And now is when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." Stop building what you can control. Bow to the one who came down. That is the pattern no king survived, and the king who broke it is the only one who can break it in you.